The first thing we look at is the continuing follow-on from the Polish air incursion the other day. We're still seeing rhetoric continuing to flow through. Not this article. I will bring it up. Okay, so sensibly, they're reinforcing or checking Poland's air defences and making sure that they're all okay and that they're capable of handling any incursion. Now, I think this, yeah, okay. So, uh, Kaliningrad, I think. Well, basically, Russia, there's an exclave there, and Belarus is considered, well, proto Russia by many. So, the drone coming across the border there, they are conducting exercises here. So, it's possible it's related to the exercises, or it could have come across. Now, uh, apparently, the range they're saying is on the order of up to 2,500 Ks for the drones that were shot down / crashed, and so you're looking at a reasonable range. The imagery that's coming out and reporting about the type of drone seems to be consolidating around a single type, and that they were unarmed. All right. So again, the articles are ramping up the rhetoric, and it doesn't help when Zelensky comes out and basically, well, he's getting a bit big for his boots here, offering to provide guidance and training to Western military representatives on how to fend off Russian aerial attacks. What drugs is he on? I, NATO's integrated air defense system is light years beyond anything he's got. And, well, it was effectively created to counter Warsaw Pact back in the day. So if anybody's going to know how to handle Russian aerial activity, it's probably going to be NATO, not him. And I guess he should stop and consider for a second where his information's coming from. He doesn't have Patriot systems providing a complete nation's air defense, and besides, the Patriots can't stop all these types of drones anyway. I mean, they still had the occasional S400 and other Eastern Bloc hardware as well in their systems. So, yeah, I mean, Zelensky calling for a joint air defense system to act as an air shield over Europe as a response for Russia's insolent behavior. I wish the media, the journalists, would stop and actually do a tiny bit of research before they blanket repeat stuff like this, or at least be courageous enough to call people out when they're wrong. There, it's not super integrated. NATO already has lots of hardware, lots of integrated air systems. There are E3 sentries that are flying around with NATO markings. They are NATO airborne early warning and control. That, I mean, yes, the US operates them as well. I mean, I think the ones the Brits operate are Brit marked, but there are NATO marked ones that operate out of continental Europe. Then there are also the air defense radars that are mostly well known where they're located, and from there you can work out where they can see what they can see and therefore tie into what they've got. Then when you look at the surface to air defences and air to air defences, you can then work out what level of integrated air defence is present across Europe, at least across the NATO part of Europe. Zelensky's talking out of his backside there, and no one's pulling him up on it. And, well, I mean, as evidenced by the reaction and the response timings and everything else, they were able to get F-35s scrambled in time to at least intercept. I mean, the drones weren't going that fast, but apparently they were able to get F-35s from the Netherlands across to Poland fast enough. And again, it's not a huge distance. I mean, at okay, so let's say they're going at 600 knots. That's 10 miles a minute. Um, they're going to they're going to get across 100 miles in uh, 10 minutes. They're going to get there real quick. And if the drones are only going a handful, like a fifth of that speed, the intercept is going to be relatively straightforward. Relatively. And the article here obviously ramps up and ties in all sorts of activity. There was so this is the BBC article. There was an article, I'm not sure if it's on Crikey. I think it might actually be in the Sydney Morning Herald article that we're about to look at next. But it's again antagonistic. I mean, you can just report that, yep, it's done. Systems are on higher alert. Troops are on a shorter recall notice. Okay, done. That's all you have to say. But you don't fill out whole articles doing that. So get rid of that one. The article here, which is, analysis, but the again, you got to think of you got to remember which way the media leans on this, and the so all right, so the way that is worded implies intent, implies that it was an intentional act, something we don't know as yet. Now, when I was talking about this the other night on stream, when my Pillars of Eternity stream kind of got sidetracked for a bit, I pointed out the way that the response happened and the nature of the response and how they knew that it was coming into their airspace as opposed to ending within adjacent airspace in Ukraine. And given that they were unarmed and everything else, for a start, it doesn't take a lot of navigational error for a system to go off heading like that. The previous time that missiles and stuff had landed on Poland, it again was initially blamed on Russia, but it had originated from Ukraine, and the interpretation was that it was an error in firing. So potentially they put in a heading 180 degrees out, transposed a couple of figures when putting in targeting data, and so the missile went where it was told, but not where it was intended. And so it was an error in targeting. And it was entirely possible the missile just malfunctioned. Happens. They're not perfect. So the discussion then was, well, why that? Okay, so it was talking about the two possible sources for these drones, and that the Russians hadn't really shown intent previously to penetrate Polish airspace. They hadn't done it. Well, it had been accused with the missiles and everything else, but the evidence later it shows that they hadn't done it as yet. Now, you got to look past the propaganda and actually look at the actual evidence. Now, people will scream and say, "Oh, this could happen or that happened." Right, great. you can say that, but you've got to show the evidence of that taking place. I suspect that it was unintentional, that it possibly was Russian launched, probably was Russian launched, and they realized after launching that an error had taken place and that they would end up in Polish territory. I suspect that they made use of probably fairly well protected, but they made use of side channels of communication to let Poland slash NATO or let the US, let somebody know that a mistake had been made, that these unarmed drones were coming across the border at about such and such a time, and that they didn't mean for that to have happened. And that's quite possibly, I mean, that makes sense in terms of how quickly the reaction was able to take place, particularly from a series of nations that are not on war footings. You can't keep troops at elevated levels of readiness without suffering penalty. Um, Hardware burns out. Systems need to be taken offline for maintenance. Systems can only sustain high rates of activity for so long. People can only sustain high rates of activity for so long. So unless there were multiple nations sitting at an instantaneous response time, the like even a lead time of 30 minutes would have been enough to allow the response that took place. And the thing is, well, how do you know 30 minutes out what's coming at you and will enter your territory compared to what is already flying over Ukraine and attacking Ukraine? And that's where I suspect there had been a side channel of information exchange or exchange of data, which allowed the Russians or whoever launched it to give a heads up to Poland and NATO and whoever in order to respond appropriately and take care of it. Because if we accept prima facie what the media is telling us, then Poland should be doing this sort of response every night. And they'd be, I mean, burning hours and burning holes in the sky on their eastern border continuously. And they'd have their entire eastern airfields shut down because there's no way to know with certainty that the Shahed drones or the other types that were launched that actually arrived in Poland were stopping. They were going to stop inside Ukraine. You don't know. You see it launched, you see it coming at you. Yet you can't make that determination without additional information, which is why I suspect additional information had been provided and not from the Ukrainians. And it doesn't stop the talking heads from screaming uninformed takes like this that beat the drums of war. And if we're to be fair to history and consider the statements made here, the Russians suffered airspace penetration during the Cold War as well. In fact, more so than than NATO did or the West did. A lot of the penetration of NATO airspace and Western airspace during, like actual penetration of the airspace, was by Russian or Eastern Bloc pilots defecting and bringing their aircraft with them. And even then, there was a degree of heads up being given so that they weren't going to be shot down unnecessarily. Going back the other direction, there were acknowledged overflights of Russia and their territories. I mean, Gary Power, for example. And those flights had been going and continuing for some time. You had the light aircraft, there was a Cessna 172 that landed in Red Square in the early 80s, I think it was. Now, what was alleged to have happened there was that because it was flying low and slow, it was below the radar detection of the air defense radars that had been powered up. Now, Russia and Warsaw forces certainly went up to territorial boundaries and went along them, just like everyone else was doing to them. That's completely normal international practice. I mean, as long as you're not violating territorial airspace, you're allowed to do that. It's international. It's the high seas, in essence. There's no law stopping that. People might get a little bit shirty about it, but it's very much standard practice. The activities by some Western nations were probably unnecessarily antagonistic. I mean, the shootdown of KAL-007 over Russia, they'd had a massive navigation failure and flew directly over the Kamchatka Peninsula. And there's still a reasonable amount of uncertainty as to whether there was an intent for that to happen. It's easily explained by the accuracy of navigation systems at the time, and it's easy enough to reproduce the error that led to that. It just would have meant that the pilots subsequently paid very little attention to what was going on outside the aircraft as it flew over some extremely sensitive Russian sites. Now, it would not be unknown for Western intelligence agencies to use civilian aircraft as cover for activities. There's an allegation that the British used the last BA flight into Kuwait to pre-position intelligence assets and, in essence, allowed the destruction of that airframe. I think it was BA 83 or something like that. There's books about it. Now, the crew involved deny any knowledge of it, and I mean, I doubt they would have been told. And there was concern even before the flight arrived as to whether or not it was still appropriate to be flying into Kuwait at the time. Well, quite obviously they didn't make it in time. They arrived and their aircraft ended up destroyed. But there was a fairly significant allegation that that was being used to pre-position spies and other intelligence assets into Kuwait ahead of, or as to keep tabs on what the Iraqis were doing. All right. So, well, and in addition, now I'm not 100% sure what the Russians and Eastern Bloc did in terms of battle groups and things like that and antagonistic practices, but there are plenty of people out there who will admit during battle group cruises and things like that for Western carrier groups that they basically aim to trigger air defense responses by aggressive positioning of the battle group, like they were about to carry out an invasion, like they were about to carry out air attacks and that sort of thing. Fly aggressively towards Russian territory and veer away right at the boundary, that sort of thing, and engage in activity that would normally be classed as hostile intent because you're flying the profile or sailing the profile of conducting an attack. You are basically putting your weapons platform, you're putting your platform into a position where it is very hard for an observer or the other side to tell whether you are actually carrying out an attack or not, because of how you've positioned and what you're doing. Now, the expectation is that you're not, because the rest of the tension isn't there, but it unnecessarily ramps tensions because it draws the opposition into a higher state of readiness because they can't tell whether or not you're actually going to attack. And the aggressive maneuvering is, well, it ties into things like rules of engagement, legalities of war, whether an enemy or a combatant was displaying hostile intent or carried out a hostile act or was in a benign posture. And it matters because one counts as you can engage as self-defense without needing higher authority. One is antagonistic, and you should not be surprised when there is a response. And it comes down to how things are done. Now, there obviously was a lot of unnecessarily antagonistic posturing during the Cold War. So it's disingenuous to come out and make statements like this and say, oh, well, it's all the Russians' fault. Well, okay, you're missing context, and you're missing the context of a lot of history during the Cold War of what was going on. I mean, Norway shares a land border with Russia. They've always been rather sensitive about what goes on up there. I mean, Finland obviously shares the land border with Russia and have always been really sensitive about what goes on in border areas. And it's one of those things of history does not back up the claim. I mean, a slanted history can if you're very selective in how you read your history, but we were talking the other day about conventions of laws of the sea and rights to free passage and archipelagic transits and straits transits and things you can do with civil shipping and, well, not so much civil versus military shipping, and what you can do on the high seas, how you can position what sort of activities you can carry out. Actually, I did talk a little bit about that because I talked about the Chinese weapons drills between Australia and New Zealand. Completely legal with what they did. But at the same time, the civil air traffic they were disrupting had no obligation to get out of the way because there had been no coordination with airspace operators to ensure safe conduct of weapons training. I mean, yeah, territorial waters are one thing, but it's polite to coordinate and deconflict airspace for what you're planning to do. I mean, exercise areas, operations areas, all that sort of stuff. In a well-developed air defence environment, those sort of things go on. So a navy that's going to go out and practice firing with their guns or something like that will have airspace, well, water space for a start, set aside so they can shoot places and not hit anybody else. But they'll also have airspace set aside so they can shoot and have the shells fly through the air and not hit anyone. You kind of want that to be the case. And this sort of coordination, yeah. I mean, to then have this rhetoric or angry rhetoric of this is what's going to happen. Well, no. Get some experience. Go and talk to people who do have experience and know what they're talking about and listen when they tell you to wind your head in. But, yeah. So, this is also disingenuous. Yes, Putin has increased the rate of missile and drone strikes since the Alaska meeting, but it misses the context of the massive numbers of drone strikes and missile strikes against Russian infrastructure and mainly oil facilities. And this statement alone makes it sound like it's only one side being the aggressor. We talked the other day about, well, you look at the back and forth of person does one thing, they say, I'm doing it because person B did this. You go and talk to person B says, oh, I'm doing this because person A did that. You go back to person A, and it's this and that, tit and tat, all the way back, and you've got to draw a line somewhere. But it's deceptive and potentially deceitful to ignore the contribution of both sides of a belligerent of combat to what's going on. Because to read this statement and take it as fact, well, it's opinion. To read this statement and take it on surface value implies that the ramped up drone strikes and airstrikes and everything else are a response to the attempted peace talks, are an attempt to disrupt them, as opposed to a military response to escalated attacks. I mean, if you can't see how that's dishonest, I can't help you. Sorry. Okay, hostile act of aggression. It's hostile act versus hostile intent, not act of aggression. But anywho, and I mean, what there? So my earlier statement about it quite likely having been an unintentional, and the Russians used a side channel of communication to say, look, we've screwed up. Here's what's going on. Here's where they're going to be, etc. Yeah. However, doesn't stop people continuing to ramp the rhetoric, particularly when they've got no skin in the game. They're not the ones sitting underneath them. And yeah, it's a selective reading of what's going on. And the problem is, anyone who attempts to take a broader read and look at what's going on, what both or what all sides are contributing to the current situation, you then get slandered as being some sort of Russian simp or a tanky, what they used to be called. It's it's just trying to resolve the ambiguity of the battlefield, remove the fog of war, look past propaganda, and try and look at what is actually happening. So, yeah, this is a call. This is a call for action. This is a call for military action. It's throwing rhetoric at the public and the political class to commit military force from somebody who realistically will have no consequences from it. Yeah, okay. And this is unrelated to the whole situation in Poland. All right, the polonium poisonings in the West. Okay, all right, they happened. Intelligence agencies do things in other nations they probably shouldn't. Okay, the Russians kind of were a little bit sloppy there. At the time, a lot of the more expanded discussion was that it was sending a message, not just to take care of dissidents, but it was sending a very clear message to a bunch of other people about what would happen or what could happen. And so, in terms of getting caught and all the other bits and pieces, it's painted as oh, they were being sloppy in what they did. Well, okay, somewhat, yes, but it's probably been successful in a grander scheme because of the message it sent to others. And but it's painted as, oh no, Russia just did this. Okay, well, okay, fine. Obviously, the intelligence agencies of other countries aren't going to fess up to the sort of things they do in those countries or other countries as well. But to assume that it's just Russians doing it is, again, deceitful. It's deceptive. It's deceptive. Uh, China only a few years ago effectively weeded out a large part, if not all of, the American intelligence infrastructure operating within China, and they all went offline. The the general understanding is that a lot of them were executed or have disappeared into Chinese jails, never to be seen again. Um, and that once their usefulness in terms of the information that can be extracted is done, they're gotten rid of. Now, the question about how China managed to find all that out, yeah, I mean, some people point to Bill Clinton possibly having leaked some stuff across. Other people point to Hillary Clinton and her mail server that was insecured properly would have had that information on it at some point, and so potentially it was leaked that way, whether or not the leak was intentional, and that burning the entire Intel infrastructure, well, didn't help the US at least. But nations engage in this sort of stuff. Okay. Hiring gangs to engage in arson attacks in London. I'd read about that, and it was a fairly loose connection, but a connection nonetheless. And okay, well that's weird. You look at it and go, why? What does it? What benefit is there to be gained? I mean, you can allege connection, but you've then got to explain why it benefits that nation to have made that connection or to have made that or to have done that initially. Or are you just painting? Or are you just creating a straw man that gives you somebody easy to point at and say this was them? Using commercial ships to break internet cables in the Baltic. Well, they were Chinese flagged vessels. Yep, the allegation is that the Russians were paying them to drag anchors through the Baltic and sever communication cables that way. But comms cables get cut everywhere. I mean, the Middle East pretty much fell offline recently when comms cables were cut in the Red Sea. Was that the Russians too? I mean, they get cut all the time. There were the cables cut off Egypt a couple of years ago. Were they Russians? Was it Russians dragging anchors that destroyed the Nord Stream 2? Okay, to keep putting out these sort of claims makes it sound like you're jumping at shadows. At shadows. I mean, back in the Cold War, the US tapped comms cables running through Russian waters. If you doubt that, look at the book Blind Man's Bluff, and it talks about some of the special submarine configurations that existed at the time in a handful of the operations that they went on, and what happened when they were discovered. Now, that seems a bit ham-fisted to say that this is a nation-state ordered event when for the last several years we've been told how scary the Russians are at changing things on the internet, that these internet agencies in Russia are responsible for election interference all over the place. Someone's not telling the truth at some point. I mean, all of these things, it, it's a struggle to believe that all of these things are true in the manner that people are saying, and eventually people get desensitized to it and believe that others are calling wolf. That may also be intentional because when a hostile act is carried out, then it will be disregarded because people have cried wolf for too long. And the question too is, what's the gain? You cut a cable. There are many other ways for internet to reach, well, particularly through Europe. I mean, it would make more sense if it was claimed that they were intercepting it, tapping it. Okay, I'd more readily believe that. I mean, and this is somebody who's scared of their own shadow and doesn't understand what militaries do and what's involved with exercises and operations, and the fact that yes, AGIs, intel gatherers, nations will shadow other nations out at sea. They'll want to keep an eye on the exercises. They want to see what's going on. They want to see if there's new procedures, if there's new techniques, if there's new weapons, how effective they are. Everybody does it. I mean, there's a whopping great big thick book sitting on my bookshelf about bricksmiths, about the activities they engaged in Eastern Germany during their time on station in Berlin. It's it is again deceptive, and it is unnecessarily antagonistic rhetoric to people who don't understand what goes on or what's going on. They see this and get frightened. They get scared. They think that this is aggressive and hostile. No, no. They have every right to be there in international waters and international airspace. They are doing no different to any other nation when there's big exercises and stuff going on that they want to keep tabs on, or operations, or exercising their rights of free passage. Because a part of exercising your right of free passage is if you don't exercise it, a claim can be made that the nation or nations controlling the waters can close passage because no one's using it. That has not really been tested, but it is often argued that that is a potential outcome under the laws of the sea, that if those passages are not made, the nation controlling those waters can take a stronger position about allowing transit. All right, it's routine. This is stuff that everybody does and is a normal routine part of the world spinning on. But they're conflating many different things under a banner of being of aggression, and it's just like, no, no, and it's just like, well, the rhetoric, it does not help. So yeah, there's a reason I stopped reading the papers.